Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on what is a sunny enough day that you didn't really have to, and to hear a talk about rural to urban migration. But I'm doubly grateful. Therefore, it's a great pleasure to be here in Greater Chicago, which features fairly heavily in the historical part of this book as a place that was formed, much as places like Mumbai are today, but not just by people arriving in the center, but by an accretion of self-built squatter housing from people who came from villages in Europe and also in the southern United States, building them in unregulated ways on the outside of the city right up into the first third of the 20th century and so on. If you look at Chicago a century ago, you're almost looking at, in some ways, some of the cities of the developing world today. The underlying topic that I'm looking at is the question of how people move from a mud floor to something you might call the middle class, which is a question that consumes much of the development world, the foreign policy world right now, the philanthropy world, and in fact the marketing world. We get studies out now claiming billions of people entering the middle class in Africa and in Asia right now. Although if you scrutinize the numbers, you find that what they're saying is that people who make family incomes of between $2 and $20 a day count as middle class, and I would not buy that somebody on $2 a day could be called middle class in any way. But the focus is on, is there a way to turn down those lights a bit? I think what's missing in a lot of that analysis of social mobility that comes in sort of marketing studies and these larger macro studies is the question of the transition of the place in the middle, the place that is the bottom rung of the ladder that may lead toward a better life, or that may cause people to be stuck. And that's the subject of this book. This is your mud floor. This is the He family who I visited in Sichuan, China. They probably have an income, if you exclude money sent from relatives in the city, of about a family income of about $1 a day, which is pretty typical of a lot of peasant families in inland China. People like them and villages like this represent the lion's share of foreign aid spending, philanthropic efforts, and so on around the world. You have things like the Millennium Village project, which is probably the largest development aid project in the world right now, devoted to that. There's a real focus on the rural village as a self-contained unit of analysis and of expenditure for a number of reasons. For one good reason, that's where most of the poverty and starvation are. I mean, malnutrition and absolute poverty are almost entirely rural phenomena, to at least 2/3, probably 3/4, depending how you measure it, around the world. But also because the village is a self-contained unit that you can drop money into, you can put in bed netting and tube wells and things like that, and cause a measurable improvement in standard of living that you can report back to your board within a 2-year time frame with some sort of quantifiable results. Unfortunately, a lot of these efforts have the effect of maintaining poverty, of making it a survivable, sustainable form of poverty in the village, but preventing the larger problem, which is that there are simply too many people living off the land in too much of the world right now. As a result, the world is not producing as much food as it should. As a result, poverty levels remain extremely high and so on, because you have a huge population who are supporting themselves off the land rather than using the land to produce food and so on. Most of them are trying to get out in one way or another, almost everywhere in the world. And if you look at the next door neighbors of this family, they now live here in Chongqing, a huge city in the middle of China. This is the Jian family, again from mud hut next door to that one, who now have a family income of perhaps $15,000 a year, which puts them comfortably in the middle class, no matter how you measure it around the world and so on. But it would be misleading to suggest that that's a typical trajectory. To find the number of people who make it from a mud floor to a self-owned apartment during their own lifetime, to say nothing of even their children's lifetime, is extremely rare around the world. And we need to look at what is stopping it. What happens in the middle, and what we're not seeing in these two photos, is what came between this, what the Jian family moved through, what the He family there are going to move through, and what most families who are leaving subsistence lifestyles move through, which is this: the transitional urban neighborhood, the bottom rung, the improvised urban community, what I call the arrival city. This is a place called Liugongli, which was 15 years ago was an agricultural village just outside of Chongqing, and now has a population of maybe 200,000, all of whom arrived from villages and built their own housing. Officially, legally, it does not exist. And in fact, it may physically not exist very soon because it'll be bulldozed and so on. But it is what people are using as their launch pad, with hopes of doing as well as the Jian family did. It is absolutely packed with every manner of small factory, computer-controlled milling machines making motorcycle parts, and plastic fabrication shops, and bathtub factories, all of them illegal, unlicensed, run by the villagers who arrived there and so on. And these sort of transitional neighborhoods fill in the spaces, the less desirable spaces and the interstices that are of ambiguous ownership in the cities of the developing world everywhere today. We have in China alone 200 million people who are members of the so-called floating population, which means they're legally villagers but living in the city, usually in enclaves like this. How do these places work, and how can we make them work? How do they become traps that people get stuck in, that become like the favelas of Rio and so on? Or how do they become devices of social mobility and the formation of social capital and creation of networks of mutual support that allow people to send their children on to education, and more importantly, well, equally importantly, to finance the villages they come from? Remember, the reason why the He family that we first saw there looked reasonably content and well-fed is because most of their income is coming from here. It's coming from the father of the family, who wasn't in that picture, who's working in a electrical transformer refurbishment factory inside this arrival city, who sends 2/3 of his income back to their village. The largest source of rural income in China since about 2005 is remittances from relatives in the city. It far exceeds all agricultural income. This is also true of Poland, of Morocco, of most Central American countries, of the Philippines and so on, that the production of food is vastly outstripped by remittances from the city and so on. So the arrival city is also the main instrument for the development of the village, for its transition out of subsistence and into more productive forms of agriculture, if it works well. Behind this, we have this phenomenon. This graph shows urbanization levels, 0% to 95%. Along the top there is North America, and there's us there in the middle at 2010, 2011. Along the top there is North America in green. We've been largely as urbanized as we're going to get for most of the last half century. The same is largely true of Europe. You can see that Latin America and the Caribbean have risen to the point that they're as urbanized as they're going to get now, pretty much. They're solidly urbanized. But the other 2/3 of the world, Africa and Asia, are right now only halfway through a trajectory that will lead them to full urbanization if things go normally and nothing cataclysmic happens. People do de-urbanize when things go very badly wrong, as happened in post-communist Eastern Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa during the AIDS crisis and so on. But we're seeing a shift of population of an enormous magnitude. What drives people to make this move? A better life, largely. I mean, by any measure, a shift from a rural to an urban living is an order of magnitude improvement anywhere in the world, even if you're moving to the worst slums of Mumbai with all their sanitary problems and so on. Is an order of magnitude improvement in longevity, infant mortality, HIV/AIDS susceptibility, education levels, empowerment of women, and also is a huge shift downward in family size in every country that urbanizes this way. I mean, Iran being a signal example, which in the mid-'80s had an average of almost 8 children per family, and now has an average of 1.7. In other words, its population is shrinking, despite having a regime and a religion which aren't given to talking about birth control an awful lot. So, you know, there's an ecological consequence to managing these neighborhoods right and causing them to work well for people. Let's look inside one, and I'll take you through how it works so you can hopefully better understand what some of the policy implications of these neighborhoods are. This is Dhaka, Bangladesh, the fastest growing city in the world by several measures. And we're in the center here right now. This is, on the left here are the apartment buildings of Gulshan, which is the neighborhood where the middle class live, where the people who live like most of us live in the center. And on the right is what 20 years ago was an empty piece of swampland owned by the hydroelectric utility in the middle of the island, known as Karail, which now has, nobody really knows how many people, 15, 20, 30,000 people living on it in tightly packed tin shacks. Hold on, let me see if I can find another shot of it. No, we'll get back to that in there. And it has grown as a product of the huge move on river and train and so on from the villages of Bangladesh. And there's sort of a mythic idea that it's desperate people who are flooded out or starved out who land in these slums and fester and so on. And in fact, if you look at it, any country in the world, there is emergency migration, but it tends to be temporary. But most of the people who move are the best invested people from the villages, those who've saved the most, those who've often had the whole village invest in their move to the city. Usually not whole families, usually first individual people who look for work opportunities to supplement the farm in the city, very often led by women these days. And then as they succeed, they bring more and more people from the family over until you reach this sort of point of equilibrium where the family realizes that they're no longer an agricultural family getting subsidies from the city, but that they're an urban family using their village as a backstop and so on, and may eventually sell out or buy up other farms or industrialize their agriculture and so on. Yes, this is the village where a lot of the typical Bangladeshi village, very poor rice farming, disease prone and so on. People move in. And what causes them to go to this particular arrival city enclave, this particular tin-roofed, mud-floored, flood-prone slum in the middle of Dhaka? Especially when there are other slum neighborhoods that are seemingly more desirable, the bamboo slums that are less wet, have larger floor space and so on. A lot of the people who move into Karail actually have moved out of these better looking slums to move here and have invested a large amount of money to buy into this particular slum. Why? Well, there's proximity to the jobs and markets that are desirable. You can get very good work in domestic jobs in these high-rise apartments, but also there are good garment factories nearby. But also, if you start a small business and so on, you can get customers from these neighborhoods to shop in it and so on. But more importantly, within Karail, there's a stable sense of property ownership, not at all legal, but whoever first sees the land offers deeds for these shacks that are marketable enough that you can sell them to someone else for a gain, and are in fact marketable enough that you can use the rising value of your slum shack to get credit also on the illegal market to finance a small business and so on. And throughout the developing world, this is an increasingly common phenomenon, is to see that people living in slums and transitional neighborhoods, their speculation on the value of their house and their withdrawal of capital from their house is the important dominant factor in their life, much as it is among middle-class people in the West. A lot of slum redevelopment projects in India and so on have tripped up on that, on the realization that there's a sort of calculus performed among the slum dwellers between the rise in property value of their slum as the redevelopment approaches and the possible future sale value of whatever they're being asked to be moved into. And in many respects, it's exactly what you'd expect. It's unhygienic, not a toilet to be found, and chaotic, crime-ridden, disease-filled, every manner of trouble you can imagine. But you start seeing things when you go in. First of all, you notice along the ground a jury-rigged running water system. Someone's tapped into one of the water mains and run what's essentially garden hosing fixed together with clamps and duct tape, and is selling fresh water services in the houses at a rate per liter that would be much higher than what any upper class people would pay. And this is a classic thing about transitional poor neighborhoods is that on a per unit basis you pay the highest price in the city. And this was true of London in the 19th century and everywhere. As well as this, you get electricity. Electricity around the world is generally very quick to arrive and illegal and jerry-rigged, and nobody pays for it. And more importantly, cable television, which is in many, many slums and rival city enclaves is the first utility to arrive, often decades before running water and toilets. And it first seems a little bit mysterious why people making maybe a family income of $3 or $4 a day would pay $3 a month for a package of cable TV programs from, you know, the Persian Gulf in India and so on. But you slowly realize it's very important to them. It's sort of a crucial thing, not just for educational reasons. These people have invested a lot to come from the village and so on, and want to learn about the ways of life and so on, but also what you might call aspirational reasons. The people see this as cable TV as a thing that you have if you're one of these sort of people. It represents a large share of your income when you first moved into the slum, but you expect it to represent a tiny share of your children's income and so on. It's almost a laying down of a marker for a future life. And a lot of the consumer habits of people in transitional urban communities can be explained by this aspirational consumerism. And when you get it further into this slum, like most of them, you start seeing a huge number of small businesses, video shops, all manner of informal food service, because remember, people working 12-hour days in garment factories and so on don't have time to cook for themselves. Convenience food, which is often, those things that kid's holding are delicious. Well, I don't know what they are, but Bangladeshi street food is really good. And for people making so little, a surprising number of video arcades until you realize that the video arcades are sort of de facto childcare services, because there's no formal education. There are no schools within this slum. The only presence of the state that you'll find is occasional police raids. You will find some charities that have drilled wells and done that sort of thing. And this slum did vote for the right party in the last election, so it might get something. But you either bribe your way into getting your kid into one of the Gulshan slums across the sewage-filled lagoon, or you go with something like this, where you're paying someone some tiny amount of money to let your kids hang out in this video arcade. And this form of child raising, and remember, if people are working 12 hours a day plus another hour each way commuting, their kids essentially have the patches between houses as their main form of education and childcare, and you get a lot of gangs forming and a lot of criminality becoming the main thing you fall into. A lot of these neighborhoods falter on the inability to do anything with children during the day and so on. And you see a lot of photo studios inside the slum, which again show aspirational scenes of sort of Oriental splendor. And you do see informal private schools throughout. And if you notice, what these girls are studying is English, which is the popular thing to study in the slum, not Bengali, not Hindi, and so on. Why are they learning English? Well, partly because among the most desirable jobs are things like call centers. There are very good jobs that people in the slum do, laying Ethernet cable in office buildings where English is often the dominant language and so on. It's an aspirational thing as well, English. And you'll see investments in education that are huge gambles in these neighborhoods on one child reaching not just sort of the next step up the rung into some low-level job, but several steps up. I mean, the slums of Mumbai, often in the back of the shack, you'll see a PC with, you know, the oldest daughter studying JavaScript or something like that, and which is a realistic bid to get out because it works for some, and so on. And often the interventions in these places fail to recognize that this is what people are after. But there's more serious industry inside as well. There's an entire garment district inside the slum, which is started by people who were former garment workers in the factories, who've set up their own little garment manufactories, employing maybe 20 or 30 slum dwellers, and doing piecework at a rate that undercuts the official factories and the official minimum wage and so on. And you also find a huge metalworking district and huge woodworking district inside. Not all people make it here either. I shouldn't be leading to this idea that these are great sort of miracles of social mobility and so on, in the sense that I'd say about half of the people who move in move back. That's almost a rate around the world. There's almost a 50-50 rate of people giving up. You could say it's almost a form of selection, in that the very best people from the villages come into these transitional neighborhoods, and about half of the people who move in end up leaving. They can't take it. They get sick. They worry about crime, all this sort of stuff. Those who do make it tend to be very, very resilient people who are very determined to get their families through. This is Maqsuda Begum, who I met. She had the dream. She was sent by her village with her husband, who became a bicycle rickshaw driver, which is sort of the main transportation in Dhaka, until he died, which is a very common occurrence among bicycle rickshaw drivers. It's a very deadly job. So she realized she either could fail her village, which was relying on the 2/3 of her income we were sending back, or she could send her 6-year-old, who was her only friend in the world, to what was essentially an orphanage, to a type of school where she can visit the kid once a month and so on. And she cries herself to bed every night because she's stuck. She can't see her kid, she can't leave her job, and so on. Many, many people get stuck in these situations. There's nothing there. What kind of interventions do places like this need? There's one set of theories which hold that simple title deeds and ownership are the solution to places like this. And you pretty much have them here. The problem with that is that you don't actually need legal ownership. I mean, a lot of these places function very well having some form of ownership that isn't legal or anything like that. They are at risk of being bulldozed if they vote for the wrong political party or something like that. But they get by with their internal markets and so on fairly well. There's another set of theories that you need massive state interventions and replacement of the slum with something else, or driving people out and so on. I find what's needed is a combination of the state not getting in the way of these places, of allowing them to develop organically as the people in them know how to do, allowing them to have their housing forms and their business forms. But there's almost a base rule of the arrival city, which is the thing that caused it to be the place that allowed people to move from the village, the thing that made it far less expensive to live in than anywhere else in the city, is also the thing that prevents it from moving to its next stage of development and so on. Maybe that's because if you're in Caracas or Rio, it's actually built up a vertical plane that physically prevents anyone from going into businesses there and being a customer. Maybe it's built on a swamp or on the edge of a railway track or a major airport, as you see in Asia everywhere. Maybe it's built somewhere that's so far outside of the city limits that, as is often the case in these neighborhoods in North America now, that it takes 3 bus connections to get there. So you're not going to be able to get to work in time to take care of your kids. You're not going to be able to get customers to go to your shop and so on. Physical access is often a very, very important intervention. A regularization that's not necessarily legalization can be very important. In Brazil, they've done great work giving people street addresses, which can change your whole life. It means you can get a real paycheck from a real job. It means you can pay taxes, which you may not welcome at first, but comes with benefits and so on. And security is very, very important, which means a variety of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it means having neighborhood police rather than police raids every 2 years, which is the usual form of policing. Remember, most police forces in the developing world are national and they're branches of the army. So the idea of a beat cop is extremely alien. I mean, there's small experiments in places like Brazil and Colombia to introduce them are considered radical and so on. But security often means things like street lights as well. Introducing street lighting in Sao Paulo was one of the things that caused things to improve vastly above other Brazilian cities and so on in the favelas. Because people can engage in forms of life that they couldn't without street lighting. It can make a huge difference. And that's often better than actually doing the things that you might think would be more important. People do want toilets. People know very well the levels of sanitary deprivation they're living under. On the other hand, they often, if you ask them, list about 5 other things they'd like before toilets. I often find that mobile phone reception is considered more important than toilets among people who live in places like this. And if you see how people are making their marginal living, you realize why that's important. It's crucial to life and so on. Also, because there's a real fear that, and a realistic one, I think, that the introduction of toilets means an injection of capital into the neighborhood that will raise the property values above the level that people can actually live in, and will cause not middle class, but lower working class people who are still better off than slum dwellers to move in and buy up the property and so on. And there's a whole history of this problem in development, is that by raising a transitional urban neighborhood to a level of sort of legal standard housing, you're raising it above the price level of the people who are moving into it and often driving them out. And there's been a whole history of failures of these sort of interventions. And often people end up living worse. Even if people do stay in their housing, they realize if it's raised to the legal size level, that economically the most effective thing to do is subdivide it into four units inside, each of which is smaller than what you started with, and rent those out and so on. So there are some innovative new ideas now on how to improve these neighborhoods in ways that use the rising property value to benefit the people who are living there, value capture methods in both the West and in countries like Brazil and Colombia and so on. Let me just take you through some of the consequences of what happens if there aren't, if the state ignores these neighborhoods or tries to brush them away, which is such a long history of. This is a neighborhood called Bulak al-Dakrur, which is on the west of Cairo in Giza, but not too far from the inner core as the crow flies, although there's physical things, as we'll see, that make it seem more remote. This neighborhood came into being, for the most part, in the 70s. There was a village there before, when thousands and thousands of people from villages in Upper Egypt moved here and built their own self-built improvised housing on what had once been private agricultural land and so on. It's a haphazard labyrinth of narrow alleys and activity. It's known to most neighborhoods as, these type of neighborhoods are known as an ashwayat, which means, as far as I can tell, the best translation is chaotic place. There are about 70 such neighborhoods, the largest of which have 100,000 people each. Probably about a third of Cairo's people live in these neighborhoods. Most better off Cairo residents wouldn't dare set foot in them unless they needed to get an electric fan fixed or their car fixed very cheap using scavenged parts and that sort of thing. There are large businesses scavenging thrown out things, rebuilding cars and so on. But increasingly, over the years, there came to be other businesses, small factories, ice cream shops, things like that, that caused them to have sort of a middle class inside these ashwayat neighborhoods. And as you can see, thriving markets and so on. And the people who had started to get a toehold in the better rungs of urban life became increasingly frustrated with their lack of access to the established middle class. The economy of Egypt, throughout the post-war period, was one with a closed and limited middle class within a protected and nationalized economy, which meant you had an inner elite working class who were loyal to the regime and who protected their interests against the people coming in from the arrival city neighborhoods on the outskirts and so on. And there's a great frustration that built up over decades and decades among this new arrival city middle class moving upwards and being blocked both economically and, as we'll see, often physically. And on January 25th this year, it was the people of this particular neighborhood of Bulak who were provided the first crowds who marched into Tahrir Square and occupied it, and so on. The organizers of the demonstration knew that the people of Bulaq were particularly angry and frustrated, that they had a history of challenging the Mubarak regime and so on, and that they were clever enough to get past the police and so on. And they became the catalysts of what became the Egyptian Revolution and so on. Why were they frustrated? Again, as I said, a lack of access to the established regime-loyal middle class who would often try to shut down their small businesses, who spent the 70s and 80s demolishing these Ashwayat neighborhoods and moving them into high-rise neighborhoods much farther outside that had fewer prospects for successful small business and so on, even if the housing officially looked better. And physical lack of access. If you wanted to get to Bulaq into central Cairo, or in fact if you wanted central Cairo consumers to get into your shop in Bulaq, you had to deal with this canal and then a set of railway tracks that the city had never made any effort beyond a few pedestrian bridges very far apart, usually running over nasty garbage scenes like that, to get to. So it was all, and you often see that. I mean, with these neighborhoods, the banlieue of Paris, the bad neighborhoods of Los Angeles and so on. Often it's physical access that is the first problem, that is tied in other forms of lack of access to the larger economy of the city. And just to end that, I'll point out that Bulaq, if you look at its physical design and its economic frustrations, seems striking like this place, which was the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, just outside the walls of Paris in 1789, which at that time was a teeming, stinking place full of tanneries, self-built housing, and so on, and people who'd arrived from villages in the south of France. Remember, at that time, only about 30% of the people in France spoke French, so they didn't even speak the language of the city and so on. They were regarded as foreigners and outsiders, and their frustration built up to the point that on July 14th, it was the people of this Faubourg who were the ones who stormed the Bastille. Of the 637 people arrested on Bastille Day, 400 of them were registered as rural villagers from outside of Paris and so on. So essentially what we saw in Cairo in January had many of the same neighborhood dynamics and transitional economic dynamics as we'd seen in Paris the big first day of the French Revolution. And you can often find this frustration between a rising and emerging very lower middle class colliding against the established regime middle class who resist the arrival city and its incursions on the established city, and the result is violence. So as far as how to deal with these neighborhoods, the consequences of failing to deal with them can be very, very high. We have to keep our eyes on these bottom rung neighborhoods and recognize that the people there are very heavily invested in their futures, often have generations and entire villages worth of savings in what seem like their destitute housing, and are searching for a second and third rung on the ladder, which is too often missing in these neighborhoods. And I'd argue that much of the aid and policy apparatus and philanthropic apparatus of the world needs to be devoted to working on making sure these second and third rungs exist on the social mobility ladder in these transitional urban neighborhoods, lest we suffer unfortunate consequences otherwise. Thank you very much. So, self-promotion, yeah.
We'll take some questions now.
One question I have is, I mean, I guess you have a pretty rare perspective being, so many different villages, and one of the problems a lot of development analysts, it seems like, have is explain variation, like where the same types of projects work differently in different places. And I guess it seems like one kind of sometimes catch-all dimension that a lot of people are proposing is like developmental social capital, like Michael Wilcox, Stephen Ryan, and the World Bank. So I was wondering if you saw that kind of variation, like if you felt that the differences in associational life are such that an outsider would be able to take that into account when initiating a development project?
You have to strip away some extraneous things that distract, often things involving cultural conflicts that are going on in them and so on. And I am excluding conflict migration from this as well, partly because it's actually numerically a fairly small part of migration to cities, but also because it has a really different dynamic and so on. While I am trying to set up sort of a universal theory of the neighborhood, of the urban neighborhoods of first arrival, you can't simply rubber stamp solutions onto them, of course. The physical forms tend to be very different, the cultural forms, the things that are barriers to success. That's why I'm saying often you need to analyze what's the thing that made it a cheap place to live. What's the thing that allowed you to have this sort of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps factor of finding a place that's much cheaper than, finding a place that nobody wants to live in, essentially. And whatever it was that made it so that nobody wants to live there generally is the thing that prevents it from progressing. Sometimes you're lucky. I mean, my home city of Toronto, the great arrival city neighborhoods after the Second World War, where the very, very poor villagers from China and Portugal and Italy came from, entirely villagers. You don't get any Romans or Milanese coming in. We're lucky enough there's this huge stock, as there were in many North American cities, of undesirable Victorian housing in the middle of the cities, which people who looked like me regarded as deeply unfashionable until the mid-70s and so on, and took advantage of that. And those ended up being sort of perfect instruments of social mobility and so on. And you occasionally see things like that in the developing world as well, as neighborhoods that are underpriced for reasons that are fairly superficial. But usually there's a profound reason why nobody else wants to live there. Usually it's a swamp. Usually it's very hard to get to, and so on. And I've seen interventions as simple as setting up bus service that have worked wonders. But on the other hand, sometimes there are really serious interventions, and sometimes rehousing does work and is desirable to the people who live in the neighborhoods. In India, there's been some wisdom in what's been done, although a lot of non-wisdom, and so on. Social capital is a tricky idea because it's a pretty nebulous concept. It's always easily applied to what's already happened, and it's sometimes hard to say what it is. It's like capacity building. It's one of those phrases that it's easy to use to justify almost anything, but and so on. But no, I mean there almost needs to be a set of case studies on these places. There are certain universal rules. The 5-story building is a universal rule almost everywhere. That's sort of the form that people take when they're allowed to develop economically as they wish, and so on. And often going either above that or below that doesn't quite work.
5-story building.
Yeah.
It's true.
Are you optimistic that these neighborhoods will sort of generate their own innovations and come up with ways to create better lives if the opposition from the more established residents is kept to a minimum? In the longer term, yes, but certainly, I mean, people call this an optimistic book because I do say that this is sort of the underlying rule of these neighborhoods, mainly because the people who move into them, that's their actual plan and project, and so on. Mind you, you could look at this book as a chronicle of failure. I mean, it's a survey of these neighborhoods failing around the world. You know that they don't all fail because there has been a high rate of social mobility in Asia, in South America especially, and so on. The places that people do pass through these neighborhoods, and sometimes measurement-wise, it's very, very hard to tell. This is part of the reason why agencies often steer away from it. The World Bank ran screaming away from a lot of these neighborhoods after some bad experiences in the 70s. is because when you put an intervention into them, the results actually don't occur where you've put the intervention in. It's not like a village where if you put in bed netting and wells, you get the improvement of life in the village. You put the improvement in the arrival city neighborhood, and the results, the fruition is felt in the villages that they're tied to, where you see an improvement of agricultural life and so on. And those improvements also happen in the next neighborhoods up, where the kids move and go to university, or go to any kind of school, or do something better than dump picking, or whatever the next improvement up is. And the neighborhood often that you put the money into seems to be remaining at the same poverty rate. And we've seen this in North America too. There was some very good work in California on Los Angeles neighborhoods, which found that the ones that are most successful in social mobility, that were sending the most poor Salvadorian and Guatemalan villagers out into the middle class, were the ones that had the poverty rate that was staying the same or even rising. Why? Because they're taking people in from the village at such a rate, they're being a successful bottom rung neighborhood, and they're sending people up. The poverty, governments have trouble understanding the difference between a static poverty rate of people who are stuck there in intergenerational poverty, and a dynamic poverty rate caused by people churning through a process, right? The difference between poverty as a state and poverty as something you pass through. And they have the wrong sort of interventions. They'll send in, social workers and substance abuse counselors and so on, when what they need is technical education and small business support and things like that. And the neighborhoods that have been more savvy in the West, that have recognized that they are arrival cities, do that. They set up secondary schools based on types of technical education that these families want and so on, and training in rudimentary business skills and so on. And it can often, as well as various other interventions that are needed, but often that can help a lot. And there's a version of that in the developing world as well. Because not all transitional urban neighborhoods get semi-gentrified, where they don't all turn into the Lower East Side and so on. And there's developing world versions of the Lower East Side. There are favelas in Brazil that sort of hipster middle class people have half moved into, that are still favelas and so on. Yeah, what we call gentrification, which can help. Sometimes an injection of a little bit of it in these neighborhoods can help a lot. And sometimes that's part of the value capture instrument of improving it, is allowing, you want to increase the housing density generally, and bringing in some middle class housing that is purchased not only allows you to finance the redevelopment, but also creates a consumer base for the small businesses and an employer base and so on. That combination can work well in poor countries, just as it does with public housing redevelopment here. Yep.
Well, recognizing every context is different and even every household is different. Curious if you've seen any trends that explain variation in that some people are able to achieve social mobility and others are not, whether it has to do with linkages to the home village or actually whatever it is. Have you seen any trends?
Well, what stops people from having social mobility is often a very, very complicated thing. It's hard to measure. And even here in the West, there's interesting studies on why villagers who came from equally poor places in Italy and Portugal have very different second generation post-secondary education achievement rates, and there's big debate about whether, is there something underlying in the culture, or is it the fact that the Italians tended to come legally in the 50s and the Portuguese tended to come illegally in the 70s, and therefore didn't have the incentives to purchase housing and businesses and so on. And you see that everywhere. And I'm not taking entirely environmental determinist arguments here and arguing that it's entirely the form of the neighborhood or the economic status of the neighborhood. There are all sorts of things going on in many of these places. But I would say that if you see a neighborhood that does get stuck, often the interventions that do work are ones based on looking at it in terms of form. And probably the largest experiment in this in the world right now is in Rio at the moment, partly out of some well-developed understanding of how to turn around the failed favela neighborhoods through state interventions, but also out of a complete terror of holding the world's two largest sporting events within a few years, and what the sort of things that tend to happen on the asphalto of Rio when there hasn't been anything done and so on. And that set of interventions is very, very interesting that the Brazilians have developed, which is a simultaneous regularization of property ownership and street title and mapping and so on, and insertion of an education system, physical transportation systems to get people in and out of their neighborhood and so on. It's sort of everything at once, blitzkrieg approach to slum redevelopment that will be interesting to see whether it works and so on. Whereas Sao Paulo took a different approach, which was to slowly add things like transportation and social services and so on, and also saw a fairly large improvement, which mainly I think came from economic development. But there's all sorts of things that can affect them. So it's I would say it's unwise to assume that people have failed to make it out of poverty simply because of cultural factors or village origin factors and so on. Often there are things that can easily get that out of the way. Mm-hmm.
I like the idea that like poverty will bring other types of success. I'm not sure like what you feel about that. Like because you're out of poverty, that means that you will have a happier life. I'm just wondering like what does poverty mean to you, or how would you get out of poverty?
Well, that's a hard thing to measure.
Right.
And one of the things I spent a lot of time looking at this is what exactly that threshold is. Because there is an exaggerated idea that going from a family income of $1 a day to $2 a day makes you middle class somehow in Africa, for example. When it probably makes you not as prone to having your children starve to death, right? And that's about it. And you get up to $3 a day, and that's when the marketing people start coming in and saying, well, you're going to start wanting to buy unitized packages of shampoo and that sort of thing, and so on. But if you want to talk about sustainable escape from poverty in a way that actually has meaning, there's actually been a lot of good work on that, of what actually a middle class in the developing world means. And there's a few different ways to look at it, and they all basically add up to the same sort of range of numbers, which is that somewhere between $4,000 a year family income and $15,000 a year family income allows you to actually own your housing in a sustainable way, allows you to afford to educate your children, allows you to be able to get the sort of money you need to start a small business, even if it's just a shop or something like that, and to have enough savings that you're not vulnerable to economic instability in a terrible way. And I'd say it's more on the $4,000 end in China and sub-Saharan Africa, and more on the $15,000 end in, say, Brazil and the Middle East. And the number of people who actually live there is actually very, very small. In South America, it's been okay. There's been a fairly high degree of social mobility during the last 10 or 15 years, and you can see that in declining inequality figures. But in China, it's very complicated. And in India, it's terrible. I mean, a lot of people make it out of the $1 a day. But very, very few people make it into the sort of sustainable life that you might call middle class and so on. There are huge rock wall barriers to that particular, sort of what you might call the third or fourth rung on the ladder throughout the subcontinent, and you need to start asking what is preventing that step upward. Yes.
You kind of touched upon that, like, a lot of times, like, the place like Alicia, like, maybe, like, once every 2 years, like, raided. I was, like, reading something about, like, the colonias in Caracas that, like, it, like, had developed kind of, like, an informal legal system, like, to deal with, like, day-to-day, like, disputes. Would you say that's, like, a common occurrence in, like, a lot of these, like...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of South American and Central American cities have had some interesting experiments with policing and things like that, and it's sort of independent of politics, because I mean, Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela have all done it with mixed ranges of success, right? I mean, Brazil and Colombia have actually seen a pretty good improvement in urban outcomes, Venezuela less so, and so on. But there's interesting experiments going on throughout those places. But a lot of other parts of Asia has a long way to go before there's anything like that, and so on. I mean, the term community-based policing, and there have been some unfortunate Western efforts to try to impose it upon places like in Kenya and so on. Which it's a little bit like NATO's attempt to impose community-based policing on Afghanistan, which essentially means empowering some warlord mafia in each village to have much larger arms and so on. So you have to be. Often these things are very hard to impose from above, and don't work very well, particularly because in a lot of transitional urban neighborhoods, when they start to fail, when either for macroeconomic reasons or for physical form reasons or because of a hatred of outsiders and neglect within the governments, what takes over are organized crime gangs that become the de facto state in these places. And I mean, Brazil's the most extreme case of that, but certainly you can see it in Nigeria and in Kenya and South Africa and in Mumbai and lots of other places where the gangs become the thing. They sell, if you want a gas cylinder for your stove, you buy it from them at 5 times the normal price in a middle-class neighborhood, and if you buy it from the middle-class neighborhood, they shoot you, and et cetera, et cetera. And they become the security as well, and it can be a very, very complicated relationship. I mean, in Mumbai, they're the cable TV providers as well, and so on, which provides them conveniently with sort of a census function. You know, you have a logbook listing where everyone lives and how much money they have and where they came from. So cable TV becomes a way to exercise a sort of statistical control over what is a very informal neighborhood that has no other forms of statistical organization and so on. So simply saying let's have community-based policing often means the organized crime gang that controls things suddenly puts on a hat and has a nicer firearm, or maybe even a cheaper one, and so on. So these things have to be done with some care, and a lot of the difficulties that are encountered have to do with the informal governments that aren't always hated by the residents that pop up. These gangs are often your kids, and often they're bringing a level of peace and order that didn't exist before the gang. So informal government, whatever you care to call it, is a really tricky thing to deal with. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I know how you said that the people that are working in the cities send money back to the villages, but at the same time the money they're making isn't that great. So in the short term, is it actually increasing the rural poverty because they're losing like these main income producing people from working in the villages themselves?
Well, remember the rural income without the remittances is close to zero. That's partly because you're consuming a large part of what you're producing, and we're not placing monetary value on that necessarily, right? The amount of money that you can earn even doing low-level stuff like selling watermelons on the street in these cities is so much higher than anything you could earn in agricultural rural income. There's non-agricultural rural income that can be all right, actually. And this is even true in Poland, you know, where, I mean, I spent some time going through villages in various parts of Poland, and a lot of the way I worked on this book, which was not a systematic anthropological book or anything, I mean, it's a journalist's book, but was to sit down with families in villages and in slums and go through their household budgets. Say, how much are you taking in, from what sources, how much are you sending back to the village, or if you're in a village, you know, how much are you taking in from the city, how much are you saving for your kids' education, whatever, and so on. And that's often the best way to learn about these places. And the villages of Poland, the money sent from Katerina, the oldest daughter who's cleaning toilets in the city of London, is like, it exceeds all of the food sales, all of the EU subsidies, and all of the Polish government subsidies together for the entire household, you know. So even a really shitty urban job provides an entire decimal place more money than subsistence farming. And Poland's one of the last sort of peasant farming places in Europe and so on. So, and that's true everywhere. And this is why people move there, right? I mean, in the slums, if things go badly for you, you might have to send your children to sell individual cigarettes on the street, right? Very humiliation. Or you might, very humiliating things. But in the village, if things go badly, your children die. That's the balance you're constantly keeping in mind. Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the Ashwayet in Cairo. Because what you were saying is this Bulat neighborhood became almost the sort of the muscle or the crowds behind the early parts of the revolution. In neighborhoods like that, what then comes next? You know, revolution happens, leaders toppled, bright new future lies ahead, or not, maybe not. So what's the role of these kinds of neighborhoods now?
I mean, this week?
No, maybe not this week.
Well, no, if you literally, no, that's actually a reasonable question, because this week, Bulak, you'll find in the headlines of the Cairo papers, because it has probably produced the largest groups of people who led the attacks on Coptic Christians in riots there and so on, right? Which is not entirely related, although not entirely unrelated either, right? I mean, and I would argue, and I can't prove this, but I would argue that during the 30 years during which the neighborhood was mistreated badly by Egyptian regimes, and its residents were attempted to be relocated into less desirable places, et cetera, Islamist, well, not Islamist, Salafist parties became sort of a social organizing thing in much the way that criminal gangs are and so on. And they became, in that way that Salafist parties often are, very, very good at street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood organization. They became sort of the main source of security, social assistance, and so on. I mean, they almost run a Tammany Hall type thing, those parties. And they've been illegal parties in Egypt for a long time. So they're like a combination of a religious force and a mafia and sort of a social service agency and so on. And so that's the other thing about Bulak, is that and it actually has a big Coptic district inside it as well. So you don't want to generalize or homogenize it or anything. But it has a lot of those problems as well. And also, there's absolutely no way to judge at this point how well the social mobility and economic access factors go, because the army still controls everything, and there's been no change in that sort of problem of having protected inside elite. And there's macroeconomic problems in Egypt that could be trouble in that one of its problems that it had a highly protected, highly nationalized economy, which then after some useless liberalizations became sort of a highly protected army-controlled pseudo-private sector economy. And essentially that gave liberalization such a bad name in Egypt that whoever wins is going to campaign against liberalization, even though it's the country that needs it more than anything else. Actually, it'll probably get an even more protected inner regime, middle class, and so on. I have more hope for Tunisia in that sense. But
the specifics of Egypt aside, if you're looking at other situations like this, where the neighborhoods like Bulat were sort of under the thumb of the regime that have then exploded, how does that play out? And I don't know, Istanbul or other...
Istanbul is the sort of the most dramatic example. And I devote the largest chapter in the book to Istanbul. And Istanbul was almost sort of the seed behind this book, in that, well, first of all, it's more a rival city than anything else in the world, almost, except for maybe Dhaka or Lagos. And in that, in 1960, it was fewer than 1 million people, and now it's something like 14 million people, all of whom have come in from Anatolia and the southeast and formed these Getchikondu self-built neighborhoods around the outskirts, which were repressed very badly and violently, and developed extremisms within them to a huge extent in the 70s, and it was the unrest in those Getchikondu, which means arrived overnight neighborhoods, in the 70s that provoked the military dictatorship of the 80s and so on. So they've been through everything. And then by almost a fluke, the post-military dictatorship government simply granted land title deeds to everyone who lived in these neighborhoods, almost as a way to, well, to wash their hands of them, but also cause them to vote for you. I mean, there's nothing quite like granting title deeds to get people to be loyal voters for you. And after another decade of trouble, essentially these neighborhoods became the new middle class of Turkey, which ran into political conflict with the established middle class of Turkey, but eventually became the dominant middle class, right? I mean, the AKP government is the government of the Gecekondu middle class, of the rural to urban migrant descended new middle class, who are much more dynamic, much more European oriented, much more open trade oriented, and also somewhat more Islamic than the nationalist, protectionist, anti-Europe, secularist middle class of the central city and so on. And so Turkey is the most interesting example of that, but it stabilized Turkey to a huge extent, right? I mean, you've had 10 years of democratic stability, and the prospect of a military coup is almost unthinkable at this point, in large part because that was stabilized. I mean, those neighborhoods were allowed to become successful and so on. And you could point to some things like that in Brazil as well. Why did it go from having military dictatorships and enormous instability to having a decade longer, 15 years of democratic stability? In large part because the arrival city, new middle class, was allowed to become the dominant middle class. And Lula, I mean, he was the leading figure of that. He was from the arrival. He was a child of rural to urban migrants, grew up in a favela-like neighborhood, and was one of the first arrival city heads of state of the New World, as is Erdogan in Turkey, right? He's also a child of rural to urban migrants. Didn't quite grow up in Gecekondu, but that sort of neighborhood, and so on. So the countries that have had arrival city governments are the ones that have bought themselves a period of stability, economic growth, open trade, and so on. So you can make that macro case that if allowed to happen, it works.
Were you inspired by, or did you even know Jane Jacobs?
Yeah, I know. Actually, a lot of this came, I mean, Jane Jacobs is the urbanist from, you probably don't know who she is. Anyway, from New York, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961, which argued that urban neighborhoods in the United States were failing because of planned housing projects and so on, replacing, and that they should be allowed to develop organically as people wanted to. And it was almost an analysis of how poor merchant neighborhoods became hipster neighborhoods or something, right? And based on Manhattan. And she lived in Greenwich Village at the time and so on, and did this sort of analysis street by street of how, and she had a whole set of theories of what makes a place work. High population density, private ownership of the street in front of you, like street access and so on. And she actually told me a story about how she got, because she'd been a writer for women's magazines and architectural magazines in the 50s, and she'd go to the grand openings of the projects, right? When the 50s, when the projects were the great new thing that was going to save America. And she'd go to them and she'd be standing there with the architects, and they'd have these those architectural renderings, which would show the beautiful buildings and the courtyards between, and there'd be these clusters of people who were always white, sitting around talking in these cement courtyards. And she'd look out over it, and there'd be this cement courtyard between the two public housing apartment buildings, completely empty. She'd say, okay, this is nice, but where's the little cluster of people, And she'd look around, and they were all back on the stoop of the last remaining Victorian row house in their old neighborhood, sitting with people and so on. And she developed a good theory about urban form and so on. And certainly, I mean, she moved to Toronto eventually, and she was a neighbor of mine, so we spent a lot of time talking about a lot of that stuff before she died. And I did have it in mind that, okay, her ideas became so orthodox in downtown North American cities that they're applied everywhere, right? I mean, the idea of loose zoning is widely understood, right? Allow the immigrants to open a little restaurant in their house and to have, to have small businesses mingled with housing and to allow the neighborhood to develop as it will and so on. That's widely understood in downtown cores, and it's been part of their revitalization in the West, in some parts of Europe and in North America. And I did kind of think we need that theory applied to the outskirts, right? I mean, you don't get that in the outer high-rise suburbs. And I mean, I spent a lot of time in the banlieue difficile outside of Paris during the riots of 2005, looking at what was behind that. And a lot of it was a lack of those sort of principles that Jane Jacobs would talk about and so on. You cannot start a business on the ground floor of your apartment building. If you're working 12 hours a day, your kids are left with the concrete pad between the buildings as the main form of childcare. It's surprised they'd join a gang and so on. And so yeah, there almost needs to be that sort of theory for the outskirts. The downtown's taking care of itself okay now.
Suffice it to say, we could all stay here and form our own densely populated arrival city, but
Yeah.
we have to break up. There's still food if you guys want to stick around and talk to Doug. That would be wonderful. And just join me in thanking him one more time.
Thank you.